Hi, my name is June, and I'm an alcoholic. Hi. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you this weekend. I've had such a fantastic time already that we could have just ended the convention an hour ago, and I would have gone home a much richer, fuller person from this conference. I've had a fantastic time, and I'm so grateful that I could be a part of it. There are some people here who are so special in my life, and I don't get a chance to see them very often. Some of them are people that are participating in the program here at your conference, and you've gotten to see how special many of them are already. And some of them are just some special friends that live in this part of the country that I don't get to see. And I've also had a chance to make some very new friends, and that's what I think is one of the most wonderful things about conferences in Alcoholics Anonymous. I love conventions. I have always gone to a lot of conventions, and I consider myself very lucky that I've been able to do that. We have a lot of them in California, and I can't hardly believe that anybody who's here for their first one or has ever been to their first one wouldn't want to go to a bunch more, because they really are something very special about Alcoholics Anonymous. Am I not doing this right? Okay. I love Alcoholics Anonymous, and the longer I'm sober, the more impressed I am with what Alcoholics Anonymous has accomplished in my life. What impresses me is not so much what it has accomplished in my life as it is that it has given me a life that I never wanted any part of and made me a person that I wouldn't have even liked when I walked through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the more it's done this, the happier I've become. And it's just it's been a fascinating paradox that has occurred throughout the years of my life in Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about what I used to be like, what happened, and what I'm like today. I want you to know that anybody who is here, who might be new or visiting, that I'm not an expert on alcoholism nor on Alcoholics Anonymous, that I'm not paid to get up here, and that I'm just another member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I know when I'm done, they'll think, well, thank God they didn't have to pay her for that, but it's very important to me because Alcoholics Anonymous is free. And it has been free since I got here, since it started. And had it not been free when I came, I never could have come. And had it not remained free, I never could have stayed. And I'm so grateful for that. And I wouldn't want anybody out there to be under the misconception that I'm one of the special people that gets paid to do this, because it isn't the way it is. Just another member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's as important for me to remember that as it is for you too. I'm one of those people that happens to believe I was born an alcoholic, and I really don't want to have a philosophical discussion with any of you about it afterwards. It's just something I believe. I believe that because there was something wrong with me before I ever started to drink, and the way that first manifested itself in me, my first obsession in life that I recall having was suicide. And my memories go back really only to about 5 and 6 years old, and the first memories that I remember having is wanting to kill myself. I never liked anything about myself. I never liked how I looked. I never liked where I was living, and most of all, I never for one instant liked the way that I was feeling. And at the age of 5 and 6 years old, I began to cut my hands and fingers and wrists with razor blades. I began to take overdoses of baby aspirin, which was all I knew about at the time. I used to beat my face and body with a hammer, and when my mother would go to the bars drinking and leave me in the car, I would take the cigarette lighter and burn my body in as many places as I could. Now, I know that many of you are not going to be able to identify with that type of behavior. I have been a psychiatrist and psychologist, and unfortunately, I can't give you the diagnosis that they would have given about why I did these things or the kind of person that I was, because I'm one of those people that, much like my friend Patty says, I always thought those people should have to work for their money, and I never told them anything. So they never got any information from me. I was raised in an alcoholic home. My mother was an alcoholic and a bar drinker, and there was a lot of violence in my home. There was a lot of broken promises in my home, and there was a lot of the same things that go on in anybody else's alcoholic home. And so I knew a lot about alcoholism firsthand. I certainly knew I didn't want any part of that way of life. But originally I recall feeling sorry for my mom and trying to help her, and eventually I began to hate her for what I considered to be a weakness, this alcoholism, and what it caused in our life. Throughout my life, there's never been anything that I could tolerate less in anyone, most of all in myself, and those things that I was to decide were weaknesses. And those have been some of the toughest old ideas that I've had to deal with in the years of being sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. But as I was growing up, I was an observer of people. I was an only child, and I know today that most of the people I was observing were my mother's friends who were also alcoholics. I looked at those two different groups of people, the men and the women in my life, and I saw that they were handling the exact same situations in entirely different ways. To the best of my recollection, before coming into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I do not ever remember seeing a man cry or in fact show any emotion with the exception of anger and rage. I thought that that meant that that's all men ever felt, that maybe if they cared about you, you could get them to punch you in the face once in a while. But outside of that, I really did not believe that you could have any kind of an emotional effect upon a man. And I looked at the women in my life, and although many of them acted with violence and rage, I saw that things hurt them. I saw some of them cry. I even saw a few of them have nervous breakdowns. I looked at those two different groups of people, and I decided immediately which one I wanted to be like. And I spent my whole life trying to emulate what I thought a man was before coming into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and even for some time afterwards. And I thought a man was someone who cared about no one, who felt absolutely nothing, and if they did, never let anyone know it. And that's the way that I tried to live my life. Those were my standards. You know, it's funny because when I was a little kid and they'd say to me, June, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, a boy. And it wasn't as easy to do back then as it is today. And my family was very concerned, and I was taken to several of the priests from the church that my family was active in, and then eventually we were on welfare, and so we were able to get psychiatrists and psychologists, and that's how I was originally taken to psychiatrists and psychologists, because I had this desire to be a boy that really concerned my family. And eventually, I guess on my own, I accepted the fact that I wasn't going to be able to be a boy. And so the way that I saw the world and the way that I saw the things around me, that left me with one alternative. If I wasn't going to be a boy, the only thing left was to be a tough broad. And I spent all my time before coming into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous trying to be a tough broad and trying to act in this way that the standards that I had set for myself of not caring, not feeling anything, and never showing it. Unfortunately for me, having set these standards for myself, I was completely unable to live up to them. I seemed to feel things 100 times more than anyone else around me did. I remember going to school and people teasing me about having curly red hair or being tall or being skinny or whatever it was. And I used to need to do this, I guess, but at the time I could remember who they were and what they were wearing and what they said exactly and what I was wearing and how much it hurt and, this whole thing. And I can remember meeting these people and these total strangers. I didn't even know their names, and they'd be teasing me. And I can remember hating myself for how much I let them affect me. Sometimes they even were able to make me cry. And to me, the idea of showing any kind of emotion, with the one exception of anger and rage, meant only one thing. It meant that you were weak. There was no other excuse for it at all. And I found out at that age of 5 and 6 years old that I was the thing that I hated the most in the entire world. I was weak. And those feelings of self-hatred that are the earliest memories that I remember having for myself were to get worse and worse the longer that I was out there drinking and using. And they were the thing that finally brought me through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous at the time that they did. I was introduced to drugs when I was 7 years old. I began to drink on a regular basis when I was 8 years old. And I am so grateful that I was. Because I'm one of those people that would have had to have been locked up in some kind of an institution had I not found them. I couldn't make it out there. And when I talk, I'll tell you about the fact that I used to drink, and most of the time I mixed it with pills, barbiturates, downers, yellows, reds, whatever you might know them as, and alcohol, because that combination got me exactly where I wanted to go. I've never been a social drinker. I've never been a party girl. I wasn't drinking to feel good. I drank so I didn't have to feel anything at all. And knowing that about me, you're now going to know that I'm not going to have a very exciting drunk-a-log, because if you take pills and mix them with alcohol like that, you can't do much. And I didn't, I know in the early years when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, there were still a lot of people who were, very upset about anybody mentioning that they had taken pills. And I don't talk about it because I'm trying to impress anybody with what a cool dope fiend I am, or was. I'm just talking about it because it's part of my experience, strength, and hope. And I found out the longer I stayed in Alcoholics Anonymous that the only people who really care about you mentioning that you mixed alcohol with anything else are the people who are in meetings still taking those things. So I don't worry about it. I found that combination when I was 9 years old, and I never altered it in any way. There was absolutely no reason to. I overdosed the very first time I ever took pills, and I overdosed every single time that I possibly could after that. I never had enough. I was never there. I was never where I wanted to be. I always just wanted out. And that's the way I tried to live my life, continually. Really, I don't believe that there were any days that went by before I came into this program that I didn't try and kill myself, put myself in a position where someone else would try and take my life, or pray to a God that I was slowly losing faith in to please let me die. It was the thing that I wanted the most. And as I said, I'm really grateful that I found alcohol and chemicals when I did, because I think it's the only thing that made it possible for me to get by out there. In wanting to be this tough broad, I looked around the area, and I grew up in a town in Los Angeles called Venice. It's a street town. And in looking around at the tough broads by Venice standards, which I'm sure are different than Richmond standards, but I used those, and it looked as though it was very important that you belong to a gang, and I did. It was very important that you do a lot of fighting, and I did. I have never won a fight in my life. However, I've never fought less than 5 people at a time. And I learned after I came into the program, my sponsor explained to me that the reasons I always fought groups of from 5 to 15 is because if you fight one person and you lose, people may wonder about whether you're really tough. But if you fight a group of from 5 and over, everyone will assume you must be tough, or why would that many people have to jump you? And so I was one of those people that walked around with my face beat in a lot on the off chance that somebody out there might think that I was tough, you know. I would stand down at the beach with my gang looking tough, and we never wore shoes because there was a tough Venice broad, you don't wear shoes. And I would stand down there, and some kind of touristy-looking people would walk by, and I'd look them right in the eye, and I'd take my cigarette, and I'd throw it down on the sidewalk, and I'd put it out with my bare feet. And these touristy-looking people would sort of poke one another and whisper back and forth, and I knew what they were saying. They were saying, "Wow, that is one tough broad." And I was very impressed that I could do this, and I was sure that they were even more impressed, you know. And my sponsor explained to me after I'd been sober for a while, he said, "You know, did it ever occur to you maybe some of those people were talking to each other and they were saying, 'Did you see that? That person just put flesh to fire. Why would anybody do anything so stupid?' You know, but that never occurred to me. And just being able to step on lit cigarette butts did not mean you were tough. You were only truly tough if you were then able to walk upon those feet as if it did not hurt. And those are the kind of things that were important to me before coming in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I have been grateful in the years that I've gotten sober that tattoos were not that popular for women when I was on the street. They became popular, really popular, a couple years after I got sober. And I knew a number of women, and do today, that have gotten tattoos, some since getting sober and some before. And most of them, though, got stuff like a panda bear and flowers and a butterfly. You know, if tattoos had been popular when I was on the streets, I'd be standing up here today, I'd have a shark on my arm. And it would swim whenever I did this. And I would have gotten something like a battleship on my chest, or maybe a canoe in my case, but that wasn't that funny. But if I had thought that it was tough, there isn't any doubt in my mind that I would have done it. You know, I was willing to go to any length to be tough. I just did it as far as I could, you know. I was brought to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous by my mother. My mother had been in and out of the program for many, many years with varying lengths of sobriety at that time. And in case I forget, my mother is a sober member today. But at this time, she was coming back from one more slip. She brought me to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, not because I asked for help, not because I wanted to go, not because she even thought I had a problem with drinking, just because she was afraid if she left me alone, I'd get her evicted from another apartment. And we went into that meeting, and the miracle of this program began for me that night, even though I didn't get sober. It began because there was a guy in that meeting that I admired more than anybody else in the entire world. And I did not admire very many people. I was very picky about who I admired. I know that a lot of you here today are not going to maybe identify or understand the reasons that I admired this guy, but I'm going to share them with you anyway. This guy, Paul, was from my neighborhood. He was from Venice. He carried a knife and had it with him at the meeting that night. He rode a motorcycle. He had tattoos. He'd been in prison. He was one of the most hostile and violent people that I had ever known. And I looked at him and I thought, wow, I never thought great people like this came to AA. I thought it was just for the weak people like my mother, and I was very impressed. If I had to tell you what I wanted in one sentence out of life when I came to this program, I wanted the ability to walk into rooms full of strangers and have everyone there back away from me in terror. Now, when you're 87 pounds, that almost never happens. But it was what I wanted. And this guy, Paul, was a guy that I had seen. He was a friend, he was a drinking friend of my mother's. And I had seen him walk into bars and walk into parties in Venice. And walk over to a table, and if you were sitting there, you just let him have that table. You know, because he was just so crazy and he could be so mean, you just never knew what he was going to do when he'd been drinking. And I looked at him and I thought, this guy has achieved everything that I want out of life. And he is in an AA meeting, and it really made a big impression on me. I got drunk the next night. And then I came back to a lot of meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. Paul was just coming back. He was another slipper, just like my mom, and he was coming back to meetings, and he was going to lots and lots of meetings trying to get sober. And I went to lots and lots of meetings, too. I never raised my hand because I did not have a problem, and even if I had, I would not have joined an organization that was allowing my mother to belong to it. So I went to all these meetings with Paul, and in between the meetings, I explained to Paul that I was not an alcoholic, that I could not possibly be an alcoholic, that I was far too young to be an alcoholic, that I wasn't anything like my mother who really was an alcoholic, and that I just could not be alcoholic. I had places to go, people to see, things to do, and I really was just not alcoholic. Now, I later found out that non-alcoholics don't have to spend any time trying to convince other people that they're not alcoholics. They already know that, you know. And finally, Paul turned to me and he said, you know what, June? He said, I'm pretty new around here, and they tell me that I cannot diagnose anybody's disease but my own. He said, but in your case, I'm going to make an exception. I've seen the way that you drink, and I've seen the way that you use chemicals, and I happen to believe if you don't come into this program and take what these people have to offer you, within a period of 6 months or less, you're going to be out on the streets, you're going to be shooting stuff, and you're going to be selling your ass. And I knew he was not trying to scare me. He wasn't standing up there like sometimes a teacher does in school and talks about something that they know absolutely nothing about just to try and scare the kids. He was just talking about facts. He was talking about things that had happened in his life. He was talking about things that had happened and were beginning to happen in mine. And I thought a little bit about what he said, that I did not want to be an alcoholic. I did not want to join Alcoholics Anonymous. And in this 2-week period of time, absolutely every alternative to Alcoholics Anonymous was removed from my life. I was living with my mother at this time. I'd only been living with her for a very short period of time. By the time I came to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, the only person in the world that I hated more than my mother was myself. And because of the way that I felt about this woman, I blamed her for everything that had ever gone wrong in my life, and a lot had gone wrong. It's awfully convenient if you have an alcoholic parent and you can do that. I hated her so much that I used to physically attack her. And because my mother was sober and getting sober at this time, she no longer felt that guilt where she had to be subjected to those attacks, and she asked me to leave her home, and I did. The rest of my family had not spoken to me or allowed me in their home, and I wasn't allowed to call or come by under any circumstances for a couple of years, and I didn't bother to try. I had been in and thrown out of either 5 or 6 foster homes at that point. None of them would take me back. I tried to get into some of the drug rehab and alcohol recovery homes that were available in the Los Angeles area at that time. None of them would take me, some because of my age and some just because of my attitude. I tried to get into a program out there called Synanon, and they wouldn't take me, and that's pretty bad because Synanon was desperate for members, you know. And then I thought, well, you know what? Who needs all those programs, and who needs this family stuff? Because none of that matters. None of that's important at all. There's only one thing that matters if you're a tough broad, and that's your gang. That's all that counts. And one day as I was walking down an alley, all 5 members of my own gang beat me up. And I found myself sitting there and thinking, you know, there just isn't any place left. And I went and I sat in an AA meeting, you know, and I was 87 pounds. I had a black eye, I had a swollen lip, I had no shoes, wouldn't have worn them at that time if I had them. I had no money. I had no place to live. I had the clothes that I had on, and I didn't have one person that I could call that would allow me inside their home. And so I raised my hand in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, you can see where it was really kind of simple. It wasn't like, would you like to go to Hawaii or join AA? You know, there really weren't any other alternatives. And when I raised my hand at that time, I know today that there were some people who didn't know about the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they. A couple people came over to me and they told me I was too young to be an alcoholic. And they didn't want a little kid sitting in their meetings while they talked about serious things. And they told me I would have to leave, and if I came back, they'd get together and throw me out. And that's not everybody in AA. That's just a few people. I certainly didn't know AA had traditions. I just figured AA didn't want me either. And that was fine with me because I didn't want me either. And I hadn't for a long, long time. And so I fell back on my number one answer, the answer I'd been using since I was 5 or 6 years old. I went over to a friend of my mother's. I went into her bathroom, which is the first place I went at anyone's home I ever visited. I found the kind of pills that I needed to kill myself, and I took an overdose one more time. And before I passed out that day, I went to a noon meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And by the time I got to the meeting, I couldn't stand and I couldn't sit, so I had to lay down. And where I got sober in West Los Angeles, they almost never call on people to share who are laying in the meeting. But for some reason, they called on me that day. I certainly don't know what I said. I know that they were able to tell I had to get to a hospital, and that's where I next woke up. And when I did, a doctor was giving me medication to make me throw up and explaining to me that the pills I had taken were to slow down my heart. And had I been there 5 or 10 minutes later, I would have been in a coma that they probably couldn't have brought me out of. And I really don't know what was so different about that overdose than any of the other overdoses that I'd inflicted upon myself. But I know that it was different. Because since that time, I haven't taken anything that affects me from the neck up. And that's how I personally define sobriety, you know. And I've done that one day at a time. The 13th of July of this year, I celebrated 15 continuous years of sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous. I want to assure anyone here that is new in Alcoholics Anonymous that I never planned on staying 15 years. That in fact, when I was first new in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, if they had given me an option on whether I wanted to live for 15 more years, I would have checked the no box. I really didn't want any part of it. I never planned on living this long. I never wanted to live this long. I just never wanted any part of it. I just couldn't die out there. You know, I'm not one of the people that stayed in Alcoholics Anonymous for being afraid to go out there and die on the streets. I'm one of the people that stayed because I couldn't take living out there the way that it was going, and I didn't think I'd be lucky enough to die. I'd been trying as hard as I could for as long as I could. I came into the program and I went to lots and lots of meetings, and fortunately for me, somebody told me about the traditions, and in particular they told me about the third tradition, the one that says the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. And that means that no one anywhere can ever throw you or me out of any meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was very fortunate. I learned how important the traditions were, how they were what gave me the right to stay here when some people didn't want me, and how they're what give you the right to stay here if you're somewhere where people don't want you. And by learning that, I got real active in service in Alcoholics Anonymous. I've tried to maintain that throughout the years in a variety of different ways, but they did have that special significance. And I would strongly urge any of you who are new or have been around for a while, especially if you've been around for a while, to find out more about the traditions and just how important they are, how they allow this function here to exist, your group to exist, and really, for me, you know, how they allow each and every one of us to be here. I want to read you something in the third tradition to give you an idea of what they were thinking about when they first decided to adopt this tradition. We were resolved to admit nobody to AA but that hypothetical class of people we termed pure alcoholics. Except for their guzzling and the unfortunate results thereof, they could have no other complications. So, beggars, tramps, asylum inmates, prisoners, queers, plain crackpots, and fallen women were definitely out. Yes, sir, we cater only to pure and respectable alcoholics. Any others would surely destroy us. Besides, if we took in those odd ones, what would decent people say about us? We built a fine mesh fence right around AA. Now, whenever I read that, and just as I was reading it today, I was thinking, who would they have talk here this weekend, you know? My sponsors certainly wouldn't have been very active members of Alcoholics Anonymous. They would have been thrown out, too. And I'm so grateful we just decided to keep it simple and have that third tradition. I I'm also grateful because, you know, that simplicity is something that that became really important for me not that many years ago. I know, you know, in the years that I've been sober, I mean, I know when I came in there were many people who just absolutely could not believe I could possibly be alcoholic. I know that there's still people today that don't believe it's possible that I was alcoholic. And that's okay. It's really not that important. When I was new, people would come up to me and they'd say, you know, kid, I spilt more booze on my tie than you ever drank. And, of course, I turned to them and told them if they hadn't spilled so much, they would have gotten sober younger. But in having that experience, you know, one would think that I would be one of the more lenient people about membership and admissions in Alcoholics Anonymous. And in fact, I found a few years ago, I went through a really interesting experience. We had a guy that was coming to my home group, the Monday Night Venice group, named Catfish. And Catfish had just drank too much. Catfish was not going to make it. I mean, I knew this. I looked at Catfish, and I just did not even know why they bothered to bring him to these meetings, because he was really gone. He sat in the front row of our meeting at Venice every week, and he took straws and he stuck them up his nose. And then sometimes while the straws were in his nose, and the speaker was trying to talk anyway, he would look around and catch something in the air that wasn't there, and then he'd sort of chew on it all through the meeting, you know. And then he'd take the straws out and he'd look at them, and, you know. And he couldn't talk. He didn't know his name was Catfish. I mean, you know. And I just thought, this guy should be in an asylum, really. You know, I really did not know why people took him to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I found it disruptive sometimes, and I just thought, man. And if there had been a vote, I'm pretty sure I may have voted to keep him out, you know. But I knew that we had the third tradition, and there weren't any votes being taken, you know. I don't even know how many years ago this was, but now maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I was driving down the street on my way to work, and I saw Catfish at the bus stop. I thought, oh, God, did he see me? If he saw me, I sort of have to stop, you know. And I just decided, I thought he probably had seen me, so I stopped and gave him a ride. He didn't have any straws in his nose, and I gave him a ride, and we started to talk a little bit, and Catfish said, I understand you're going to school, and I think it's great. Now, I didn't think Catfish could put that many words together, and I didn't know how he knew who I was or that I was going to school. And this really was interesting, and I picked him up every day for a couple weeks. He just happened to be at that bus stop every day when I was passing by, and, you know, we started. But it was really interesting. You know, he was pretty strange still. He's not the kind of person you want to take home to meet your mother, although with my mother it'd be different. But anyway, and about 3 or 4 years ago now, I was at one of my regular meetings, the Tuesday Night Westwood group, and they announced that a guy named Walter was taking a cake for 7 years. And this guy got up, and it was Catfish, and he was wearing a suit, and he used words like some of my college professors used. And I would have kept that guy out of AA. You know, I would have just thought it can't work for him. He's just too sick, too far gone. And so thank God we keep it simple and we don't have things like that, you know, because he's been a real important lesson for me to learn in Alcoholics Anonymous. I've been very fortunate, too, that one of the other lessons that I have learned from my own experience is how important slippers are. You know, it's interesting because so many of us sometimes, you know, we just like to just throw them away or give up on them or whatever. My mother slipped in and out of this program with varying lengths of sobriety for about 16 years. And today she is sober. And she will be if she continues to do what she's doing one day at a time. She'll celebrate 10 continuous years of sobriety in December. And had it not been for my mother, even though she didn't stay sober after she brought me here, I might not have come when I came. And the man, Paul, that I told you about that was so important in my staying in Alcoholics Anonymous, was not able to stay sober. I ran into him about 3 years ago, and he lives in a little hotel in Culver City in one room. And he's the only person that I've ever known to be alcoholic, that I've ever bought a drink for. I ran into him, and we went in, and I said, you know, we just hadn't seen each other since I was brand new in Alcoholics Anonymous, and we almost didn't even recognize each other. And we went into this, I said, let's get a cup of coffee, you know, in an AA, right? And so we sat in there, and I ordered my coffee, and he ordered a beer. And we talked for a little while, and he told me that his mother had passed away, and his brother and his daughter won't talk to him or have anything to do with him anymore. And he looked at me, and he sort of started to cry, and he said, you know, I must have taught you really good. And I thought he did. You know, he gave me the message of Alcoholics Anonymous, even though maybe he hasn't gotten it yet. And so I try and share that story with people sometimes when they're telling me about how annoyed they are by some slipper that's sort of hanging around and not doing any good. A lot of times, they're the only message that any newcomer gets, and it's an important one for them to give. And if this voice doesn't straighten up, I'm going to just kill myself. Jeez. This is the way I do in court now. Anyway, the longer I'm sober, the more grateful I am for the people who were here when I got here, and for those people who tolerated me in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I choose the word tolerate rather than love because it's far more appropriate in my case. There are many newcomers who come into this program who are very lovable. I was not one of those. I came into this program, I had a bad attitude. I don't want you to think I got sober and suddenly developed this bad attitude. I wouldn't want to mislead you in that way. I simply came here with the only attitude I had ever had, and it was bad. I did not like women. I didn't like me. I didn't like my mother. I figured any other women in here had to be like one of the two of us, and I didn't want anything to do with women. I didn't want to sit next to women. I didn't want to talk to women. Certainly wasn't going to hug or kiss women, and I didn't like to listen to women speakers, which is something that always makes me feel better because I know there's never as many people listening to me as it looks like. But anyway, now as far as the men were concerned, the only men I had ever known were alcoholics who beat up women, and they scared me. I didn't want anything to do with them either. Now, when I got sober 15 years ago in L.A., all we had were men and women, and I had a problem right away. I went to 21 meetings a week most of my first 2 years in Alcoholics Anonymous. And, well, I would just, you know, I just got to these meetings. I mean, I didn't usually accept rides or ask for rides. And I would just either walk or I would hitchhike, or if I had enough money, I would take the bus. And I smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and I lit all of them myself. Occasionally someone would hold a match, and I allowed them to hold it as long as they liked, but they never lit my cigarette with it. And sometimes someone would hold the door open for me, and I let them hold it until they got tired, and when the door closed, I opened it for myself only, and I closed it, you know. And basically what I really wanted to do was I wanted to let everyone here know that I was just fine all by myself. I didn't need anyone. I was just fine. Now, of course, I know how funny that is today, because if you're fine, you never come here, you know. When I got into this program, I had a very limited vocabulary. Consisted almost solely of profanity, the exception of a few other words, the, and, mother. And I found many people in Alcoholics Anonymous were extremely offended by the use of that type of language, and so I tried to use it more when they were around. I didn't wear shoes most of my first 2 years anywhere, but certainly not to meetings. After a while, I'd been sober a little while, I started smoking cigars and then later a pipe. I kept wearing my jacket from my gang that on the back said, "Do unto others," and then split. And I wore motorcycle chains around my wrists and my ankles. And then that's sort of the way I went to meetings. And I want to let you know that if you are as hostile and as rude as I was and you dress like that you too can sit in a meeting, not quite this big, but fairly large, and have an entire row all to yourself. I was able to do that, you know. By the time I got to this program, physically I was not in that bad of shape compared to many people that I've seen come in, you know, after me. But mentally, I was really in there with some of the worst newcomers that I've seen, you know. They used to put me at the door as a greeter, the Westwood meeting. And I would stand there barefoot with my motorcycle jacket and chains, smoking a cigar, welcoming the newcomers as they came in. Sometime as they walked by, I'd hear their sponsor say, "You see, if you keep drinking, you'll end up like that," you know. And somebody would come up to me and they'd say, "Hi, I'm Mary," and I'd say, "Hi, I'm June," and somebody would come up and they'd say, "Hi, I'm Kathy," and now I'd heard 3 names and I couldn't remember which of them was mine, you know, and it was just terrible. And I would sit in meetings and I really couldn't concentrate for that long. I couldn't read. I had once been able to read. I could not read one sentence in the big book and remember from the very first word to the last word. I just couldn't do it, you know. And I heard music the first 9 months that I was sober, whether the radio was on or not. And I don't mean just music. I heard words and I heard all the different instruments, you know, and I heard the harmony. I mean, everything. And I never told anybody in AA that because I thought they would lock me up in a mental institution. I never told anybody until I was about 9 months sober, and this woman got up and took a 1-year cake, and she said that she heard music the first 9 months that she was sober. And I thought, God, I should have talked about it. We're probably listening to the same station, you know. It was really funny. I talked at a meeting on Easter Sunday about 2 years ago in Los Angeles, and this guy came up to me and he said, and you could tell that his sponsor was the big guy behind him making him come up. And he said, "I wanted to thank you for your talk." He said, "That was a very good story. I don't believe it was your story, but I like the way you told it." And I thought only in AA would we think they made that, you know, they're making it up to, you know, to make their story better. And it was so funny because I thought if this guy saw me when I came in, he would believe my story, you know. And it was funny because last night I was talking to a guy, I think his name's John, from Florida. And he came up and he said, about 13 years ago, this guy who was kind of like a sponsor to me was talking to me, and I was kind of telling him I was too young. And he said, "I got somebody I want you to meet." And he said, "He drove me over to meet this girl who lived in one room, and she was smoking cigars. Could that have been you?" Like, yes, that was me, you know. And he looked a little surprised. You know, I was wearing pink. And I didn't wear pink until after I was 10 years sober. You know, tough brides do not wear pink. Anyway, I got real active in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I went to lots and lots of meetings. And I got active in whatever they needed me to do. They told me it was important. I didn't feel bad about that because the library has lots of books, you know, and I needed these. And I remember talking to my sponsor. I had 2 sponsors in the early days, and I called this guy Jeff up, and I said, "Hi, Jeff, I stole the big book at the library today." And I thought about this years later. You know, Jeff didn't say to me, "You know, June, we no longer steal now that we're members of Alcoholics Anonymous." I remember he said, "That is great, kid, you got the book," you know. But hey, if it was important enough for me to steal it, it was important, you know. So I didn't just waste my time out there. I was a couple of years sober, and I realized that I had to make amends for stealing those library books along with about 40 or 50 others that I'd stolen over the years. Great classics like Misty the Seahorse, the things you steal when you're 5 and 6 years old. And I loaded them up and took them down to the local librarian. I explained to her that I was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was necessary for my sobriety to return all these books. I asked her if it would be okay if I made payments because they wanted 3 to 5 cents a day, and I'd had some of the books for 11 years. And she said that was fine. She said it was sort of funny, though, about this big book. She said she used to work in this library in Laguna Beach, and this man had come in. He'd had the book for over 25 years, and she said, "I guess you guys do this all the time." When I got to this program, I had a 7th grade education, and I refused to go back to school. Instead, I got the kind of jobs that you can get with a 7th grade education. And I worked there for a while, and I really didn't like it that much. And my sponsor found out about a chance for me to go to college and learn how to be a secretary. And if there's anything in my life I never wanted to be, it's a secretary. There's very few tough broads that are secretaries, and it was just not on my list. But she insisted that I go ahead and give this a try, and I went ahead, and started, I took all these classes and stuff, and I started out typing 17 words a minute with 9 errors. I typed one day at a time for 14 months, and at the end of that time, I was typing 37 words a minute with 19 errors. And they told me that I was just never going to make it as a secretary, but they said I could get these other office jobs. And now came one of the hardest times that I recall in the early years of my sobriety. I was very, just the way where I had come from in coming into Alcoholics Anonymous, it was very simple for me. I didn't have a TV, so there weren't any shows I wanted to stay home and watch. You know what I mean? I just went to lots of AA meetings all the time. I didn't have any place else to go, and I see some of my newcomers, when they're talking to me, and they go, well, I've got aerobics on Wednesday, and Thursday, and Friday night I watch Dallas, and I'm like, well, great, next time you need a drink, call JR. I mean, drives me crazy. But anyway, it was a lot simpler for me, so I was just going to these meetings and stuff, and so I led a very sheltered life in Alcoholics Anonymous, except for my job. I just went to work in between meetings, and because I was going to 21 meetings a week, I worked a lot of split shifts. I'd work 3 hours and I'd run to a meeting, and then I'd go back and work 4 hours and I'd run to a meeting, and and that was sort of how I got by. And the only place I felt at all safe was in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that was where I wanted to be all the time, and I tried to be as much as I could. And when I went ahead and I got this job, now it's time for me to go, I got this school thing, now it's time for me to go out and look for a job. And this was really hard for me, Bob and I were talking last night about one of the things that I had experienced when I was about 11 months sober. I was taken to a convention at the St. Francis Hotel. It was the International Young People's Convention in San Francisco. And I'd grown up in Venice. I'd run away once and made it about 6 miles east to Culver City. And that was about as far as I'd ever been, And now we were driving over 400 miles to this convention. And I had been to conventions by this time. I was 11 months sober. But we pulled up at this convention at the St. Francis Hotel, and I don't know how many of you have ever been there. I have never been back, so I only remember the way that it was that day. But we pulled up, and I had never seen any place like the St. Francis Hotel. My mom being, an alcoholic, we lived in a lot of hotels and motels, but they did not look like this, And they had, I looked inside, and they had these long red velvet drapes, and they had these beautiful red, that real rich, not red, but maroon carpets, And I looked inside, and all the men were wearing suits, and the women were wearing dresses, and it was daytime, for Christ's sakes, And I looked in there, we had about 17 people in a car for 4, how you usually go to a convention, and everybody goes, okay, we're here, And they all got out of the car, and I wouldn't get out. And they go, come on, the convention's in here. I said, I can't go in there. People like me don't go in there, I knew that I wasn't good enough to be in a nice place like that. I knew I was never going to be good enough. I knew that I was nothing but a dirty little Venice broad, that that's all I had ever been, and that's all I was ever going to be. And I knew if I walked in the doors of that hotel that somebody was going to come over and they were going to ask me to leave. They were going to say, this is a nice place. It's for nice people. You'll have to leave. You're from Venice, aren't you? It was really hard, and it took them a couple of hours, and they finally convinced me to go into that hotel, and I went in, and I went in the room, and I hid, and it's the only convention of Alcoholics Anonymous I've ever been to, and I've been to hundreds, but I never went to one meeting. I just hid in that room all weekend, scared that somebody would find out that somebody like me was hiding in a nice place like that. And that's sort of how I felt about myself after being sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, because I found in Alcoholics Anonymous being sober, I had all those same feelings I'd always had about myself. I hated the way I looked. I hated being tall. I hated being skinny. I hated having curly red hair. I hated where I came from. I hated how I felt. I hated everything about my life. But even with those feelings, and even feeling that way about myself, I'd sit in these meetings and I would listen to somebody, and they would share about feelings like that, maybe worse than mine, maybe not as bad, whatever it might be. And they would say that somewhere along the line in their sobriety, whatever point in time it was different for every single one of them. They were able to get out there on the street and look people in the eye and feel like just one of God's kids, no better and no worse. And that was the hope for me. I never thought that I would feel like that, but I thought maybe if I went to lots and lots of these meetings and I tried really hard, maybe if I looked in a mirror someday I wouldn't feel nauseous. And that was hope enough to keep me coming back to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. And when I finished this course, it was after that time in San Francisco. It was time now to go out and look for a job. And I did not know how to dress for these jobs. They usually want you to wear shoes. And I had never really known anybody closely that worked Monday through Friday in the daytime, in citizen-y type jobs, and that's what I call those people, like citizen-type people, And so some women in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, they gave me some clothes that they had, and then we went down to Salvation Army and we bought me some other clothes, and they sort of told me what was appropriate to wear for work, and we put these clothes on for me to go out on job interviews, and it was like Halloween, look at the little Venice bride in the citizen costume, So I went around and I interviewed and I kept interviewing, and finally I got a job. I was so excited, I walked in and I got this job, and I knew my sponsor was going to love it. It was in an insurance company. It was so square, and I worked really hard, and on the 7th day they called me in the office and she said, "I'm sorry, we're going to have to let you go. But you just don't have enough experience for this job, and not only that, dear, you don't seem to have any common sense whatsoever." Now, I didn't know what common sense was, but I knew I was being insulted, And I left there, I went across the street, and I called the Los Angeles Central office. I said, "This is June G. I'm a sober member. I have just been fired, and what are you going to do about that?" And they just laughed. I mean, I had been to hundreds of meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. I had never heard of anybody sober being fired. Everybody gets fired before they come to AA, not when they're sober, and I didn't think we'd allow things like that to happen. I thought we would picket, or something. And I remember talking to my sponsor that night, and I said, I never got fired before I came to AA. And he reminded me I'd never had a job. And that's why sponsorship is so crucial. That never occurred to me, They can see all these things that we just never think of. And now I had to go out and look for another job, and I looked and looked and looked, and one day this woman on the program told me she heard about this interview, and she drove me all the way downtown L.A., and I went in, and it was a bank. I'd never even been in a bank in my life. And I filled out this application, and it says, due to the fact that as a bank employee, it's necessary that we do a thorough background check because you're going to be bonded. I thought, oh, no, not me. I mean, I don't want anybody checking into where I've been, my background. I mean, first of all, they call one library, and I've had it, I just didn't like that. I just wanted to close the door on my past and, get on with it. But I went ahead and I turned in the application. I tried that thing about leaving the results up to God. And I went ahead and turned it in, and I got called back on an interview. And not only did I get hired to work in the bank, they put me to work in the vault. And I didn't even know if AA worked that good, But I didn't take anything. I just couldn't believe it, And while I was there, I decided to take a class so that I could get a driver's license at night. And I worked full time, and I started to take that class, and I took an English class to see if I could learn how to read again. And I kept working there and taking a couple classes at night. And I ended up getting laid off at the bank, and I got offered a job on a college campus, and I was able to go to school full time and work full time. And at that time, I had found a garage in Culver City for $40 a month where I lived, and a bunch of people on the program. One person gave me a lamp, and somebody else gave me a little rug, and somebody else gave me a bed, and and I kind of got along okay, and that's where I lived, and I went to school, and I just sort of did it one day at a time, and suddenly I'd been going there for a while. They called me in and they said I'd completed all the requirements for what they called an AA degree, college. College degree. I thought that was a nice name for it. And I had never wanted a college degree. It just wasn't on my list. When I walked through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous, if you'd said, hey, would you like a switchblade or a college degree? I mean, there just wouldn't have been any need to think about that, And that's what I had happen. And when I was walking up to get my degree, there were a couple sponsors and a couple sets of foster parents, and my mom and my aunt were there. And as I walked up, they announced that I was graduating third in my class out of 485 students. And all I could think about as I was walking up there is that, that's the same person that used to stand at the door and couldn't remember which of the three names was mine, and couldn't read. I didn't bring much here for Alcoholics Anonymous to work with, and it's really amazing some of the things that have happened. And that wasn't on my list either. I went ahead and I kept going to school, and it was interesting. I had this sort of a tough decision that I had to make about which school to go to. It was between USC and UCLA. I had narrowed it down to that. My sponsor had helped me, and I didn't know which one to go to, and I sort of wanted to go to USC the most, but UCLA was cheaper, and I didn't know what to do. And my sponsor said, look, I've helped you as much as I can. You're going to have to make this decision, And so I heard somebody talking in a meeting about a God bag. They said you just take this brown paper bag, and you write all the solutions to your problem on a separate piece of paper, throw them in the bag, and then pull it out. So what I did is I wrote a piece of paper, and I wrote USC, and I wrote another piece of paper, and I wrote UCLA, put them in the bag, shook it up, and as I said, I really did want to go to USC. I reached in and I pulled out UCLA, so I thought 2 out of 3. So anyway, the God bag really didn't work that well. It's sort of like that story that I used to hear old-timers talking about this guy who's walking down on a road, in a mountain road, and suddenly he trips and he falls. And he's falling way, way, way down into a canyon. And right before, about halfway down, he grabs this tiny, tiny little twig, and he's hanging onto it, and it's creaking, and it's just about to break, and it's still a long, long way down, and he yells, God, if there is a God, do something. And a voice from up there says, do you really believe in God? And the guy says, yes, do something. And the branch is creaking more, and he feels himself about to fall, and he says, do something. And the voice says, do you really believe in God? And he says, yes. And the voice says, then let go of the branch. And the guy looks way, way, way down, and he looks back up and he says, anybody else up there? And many times I've felt like that's sort of the situation that I've been in. I've been pretty sure what God's will was for me, but it just seemed kind of scary to try it. I went ahead and I went to UCLA. Maybe the God bag does work. And I finished there, and during that time I had filled out these papers kind of to do the footwork for this dream that I had had. And that was how my sponsors had raised me in Alcoholics Anonymous, is that if there's something that you want to do, you have to do the same footwork that anybody outside of AA would have to do. You can't just sit around your local club and ask God to, make you president of General Motors, and that's not the way everybody feels, and some people might think my sponsors weren't spiritual, but it worked for me, So I went ahead and I filled out these applications, and I sent them away, and maybe 7 years ago or so now, I got a letter saying that I'd been chosen as one of 300 out of 3,000 applicants to go to law school. And I'll tell you, when I walked through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous, I had always planned on spending a lot of time in court. But never on that side of the table, And that is just not possible. I mean, it's just not possible to go to the law school that I went to from where I came from. And yet it happened. It happened here in Alcoholics Anonymous, and it wasn't on my list. And I went ahead and I went to school, and it was hard, It was hard in many, many ways. It was as hard study-wise as it was to deal with those feelings that I still had of not being as good as, and of being a dirty little Venice fraud, and those things that I still had to keep dealing with. But it was somewhere in there, in law school for me, and I was almost 10 years sober before I really started to accept and believe that we're all God's kids, And that doesn't mean I feel that way 24 hours a day. There's some days where I still feel less than, or I think you're greater than, or whatever it is. But I really started to see, and I started to see that I've been very fortunate that I've found something called Alcoholics Anonymous to help make me the person that I am and to give me the life that I have. But that we're not the only great people in the world, that there's a lot of other great people, and they're using other things to help make them that way. And I thought that was a really special lesson, so that I could really see that we're all God's kids, not just everybody in AA is God's kids, and those other people are all lost. We're all God's kids. And that was an important lesson for me. I'm going to tell you a little bit real quick about my sponsor. My first sponsor, one of my first sponsors in AA was a woman, and that should surprise you since I already told you how I felt about women when I came to this program. I went to these 21 meetings a week in my early years as Friday, and it seemed as though a woman named Gail Wilson talked at about 18 of those every week. And so I thought to myself, perhaps if I ask this woman to be my sponsor, I can find out where she's speaking, and then I won't have to go hear her all the time. And that's how I got a woman for a sponsor. And Gail was one of those people that the big book was talking about with respect to me, that are people who normally would not mix. There is absolutely no way. I have tried to think of another situation where someone like Gail and I could become what we became for other than Alcoholics Anonymous, and I can't possibly think of it. Gail was almost 3 times my age. She was from Kentucky. She not only didn't use the kind of language I used, she didn't know what most of the words I was using meant. She wore pink. You know, there were many reasons why Gail should never have become my sponsor. And somehow she did. And I would go to meetings, and Gail would see me, and she would say, "Look, June, do not sit next to me at the meeting. I can't take the cigar smoke." And then as I'd turn to go get a seat, she'd say, "And not only that, please don't tell anyone that I am your sponsor." And that was fine with me because I didn't want anybody to know that a tough broad like me was hanging out with somebody who was lame like she was, you know. And so Gail and I would meet secretly after meetings and talk about AA. And when I was scheduled to graduate in May of 1983. In January of 1983, it became clear that Gail was very, very sick. Gail had had cancer for a couple of years, but she had told me that it was in remission because she was worried that I might not finish school, and I'd be so worried about her. And in fact, it was not in remission. And in January of 83, Gail was, I believe she was 46 years old, and it was very clear that that she was not going to live to the graduation. And we talked a lot about my graduation. I gave her the first graduation announcement. There probably wasn't one single person, and no one single person, I think, changes our lives that much, really, because there's so many that have affected my life and probably yours too. But Gail had a lot to do with helping me to get into that school, and she'd help me by giving me clothes to wear so I didn't feel, you know, like a little lost lamb in school and look funny and stuff like that. And she had a lot to do with helping me get where I was. And we sat in that hospital and we talked a lot during those last couple of months. It was funny because, you know, she was getting treated by so many people because she was so sick. These people would all come in and they had no interest, I'm sure, in meeting me, and she would insist on introducing me. "Nurse Smith, I want you to meet Junie." She said, "Junie's going to be an attorney, and she's, you know, she's like a daughter to me." And I would meet these people, and I would think, isn't this funny? This is the same woman who used to say, "Don't sit next to me at the meeting, and don't tell anyone that I am your sponsor." And now she wants to introduce me to absolute strangers, you know. And anyway, and then we would sit and we talked, and we talked. Obviously, we talked about AA and incredible things that happened in Gail's life, just incredible. I mean, you would have to hear her story because it's, you know, for you to know where she had come from. But they had incredible miracles that happened in her life, and we talked about those, and we talked about, you know, me. And she said, "You know, June," she said, "when you asked me to be your sponsor, I didn't want to." I know that's hard for many of you here to believe, but it was hard for me at first. But she said, "You know, I just said yes because that's what I've been taught in Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, you were not baby of the year of 72, you know." And she said, "But, you know, when I would sponsor you and we would talk," she said, I looked at you and she said, "I thought with her attitude and her background, this kid is going absolutely nowhere. There's just no chance, you know." And she said, "And I remember you were a couple years sober, and you said, 'Gail, I'm going to take a class over at the local college.'" And she said, "I thought, she'll never finish. She's never finished anything yet, sober or not. She'll never finish." She said, "But I didn't say anything." And she said, "And then I remember you took classes, and not really all that many, and you said, 'Gail, I want to go to law school someday, and I want to be a lawyer.'" And she said, "I had to force myself not to laugh out loud." She said, "I knew you could never do that, but I didn't say anything." And we talked about why she didn't say anything. And, you know, Gail never believed in June. Gail never believed June could do great things. Never. But Gail always believed in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's why she didn't say, "You can't, it's impossible, it won't happen," because she'd been sober long enough to see all those things happen in other people's lives in different ways. And Gail passed away in April, and her funeral was on my 21st birthday. And I graduated in May of 1983, and then I took the bar exam in any state that you wish to practice. I'm not saying this, you know, to because I don't think anybody knows it, because I didn't really, but you have to take a bar exam in that state, and I took the California bar exam because that was the state I wanted to practice in July of that year. And to prepare for that, I did absolutely everything that everybody else did. I never missed a class. I never missed a moment. I went to all the meetings that I regularly attended. I did all the studying that I possibly could do. And on a daily basis, I turned my life and my will over to the care of God and prayed for the knowledge of His will, and I tried to do what was asked of me. I took that exam in July of 1983. In December of 1983, I received a telegram telling me I did not pass, and I absolutely could not believe it. I could not believe it. There was not one more thing I could have done to get ready for that exam. I just didn't know why this would happen. It was December of 1983. I had enough money in my checking account to pay my rent, and that was it. I couldn't buy food. I had all these loans, thousands and thousands of dollars that began becoming due in December. I couldn't pay any of them. I could not put $1 in a basket. I was, 11 years sober, and I felt like such a failure. I thought, how can you be 11 years sober and not even be able to put $1 in the basket? I just was humiliated and embarrassed. I felt like I'd let Gail down after all that she'd done for me. And I had to go to a meeting and talk that night, and I want to assure you if there's anything I did not want to do, it was that, But I showed up because that's the way I've been taught. And two of my very closest friends in Alcoholics Anonymous, who've sort of taken over as my sponsor, we all got sober together. They were there that night. And we went out after the meeting and we talked, and I told them about the telegram, and that's why they had come to that meeting, even though it wasn't anywhere near where they lived, to be there for me. We went out after the meeting, and I told them that I hadn't passed, and we talked about that, and I said, look, I got to go back and be a waitress, that's what God wants me to do. This was stupid. It was a waste of everybody's time, and it was a waste of all these thousands of dollars because it's just not God's will. And that's why law school was so hard sometimes, because it was never God's will. And when you're talking to your sponsor, like remember when you're new and you call your sponsor and you say, okay, my rent is due tomorrow and I don't have the money. And they say, go to a meeting. And you say, all right, maybe I talked too quickly for them. So I'll try and explain it slower. All right. My rent is due tomorrow. My landlord is not in AA. He wants the money. I do not have it. Now do you understand? And they say, yeah, go to a meeting. And it's sort of like, it would be like walking up to someone and saying, what time is it? And they say, it's a horse. It's no answer. It's no help at all. And we had one of those conversations that night. I said, this telegram says I did not pass and I'm supposed to go be a waitress. And they said, no, this telegram says you did not pass and you're supposed to take the test again. And I said, no, it doesn't. I'm not. It is not God's will. I owe thousands of dollars. They said, borrow more. Take it again. So I thought, what the hell? I can't pay the ones I owe now. So I borrowed more, the American way. And I went ahead and I began to study again for the exam, and I did absolutely everything that I possibly could to prepare for the exam. And I took it in February of 1984. It's only offered twice a year. And in June of 1984, I received a telegram telling me that I had passed. And I'd like to be able to tell you that my spiritual relationship with God in AA was the same after both telegrams. However, those people who know me well know that is not quite true. I felt so much better about God in AA when I got that second telegram. I can't even tell you, But I never thought of drinking or killing myself, no matter which telegram I got. And that's really the miracle of this program for someone like me. But anyway, when I got that letter, there was another letter in there, and it says that before you can practice law in the state of California, you have to be sworn in. It's really just another way of getting a couple $100 more out of you. But they said that this swearing-in ceremony would be taking place on June 13th. And that would have been Gail's 21st AA birthday if she had been alive. And so sometimes I think maybe that's why I didn't pass on that first time, so that I could celebrate on that day that meant so much to Gail. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a few more things, and then I'm going to sit down. I have a job today that most of the time I love very, very much, and I feel very fortunate to have. I used to hear Chuck C. talk, and I know many of you have, quite often in the early years of my sobriety. And to be quite honest, many of the things that he was talking about or saying just really didn't make any sense to me. I didn't understand a lot of the words he used or the sayings he used. It just really didn't make sense. And I remember one of the things that he used to say the most, that I remember him saying a lot, was, if you go to work Monday through Friday just to get your paycheck and to have the weekend off, you're cheating yourself and everyone that you come in contact with. And I thought, this guy is crazy. Because if it's not all about your paycheck, what is it for? Nobody goes to work because they like it. That just can't be true. And I never understood that until a few years ago, when I was maybe around 10 years sober, and I was waitressing. And I started to go to work as a waitress to be of service and not just to make my tips. And I found that I was so much happier about the way that I was doing my job. It didn't change the job at all. But my attitude about the job and being of service and trying to get somebody the ketchup and the mustard because they needed it for their sandwich and not because I wanted them to leave me an extra quarter made a lot of difference in my life. And I started to see this being of service thing, and in a more obvious way. And today I go to work and I try and be of service. And I don't go just for my paycheck. And that doesn't mean that if they called me in and they said, you won't be getting any more paychecks, I wouldn't be upset. I'm not saying that, but that's not why I go. And I don't just wait every minute for Friday to come. And I'm very grateful that I have this job. I'm going to tell you one more story about this job, and then I'm going to sit down. I want to tell it because as long as I have been sober, Kevin and I were talking about this at lunch, we still go through, problems and hard times and doubts, about all kinds of things. And so many times people who are new, they think that they just need us, and they forget, that we need you, that it doesn't have anything to do with how long you're sober. And anyway, I had this, I have worked at this job, and I like it very, very much. I've done very well in this organization. It's a very big firm that I work for. And after I had been practicing law there for a couple of years, they called me in the office, and they said, this boss, one of my bosses said, we just wanted to thank you because we think you're wonderful. We love your attitude about this job, and we're so glad to have you. And there are 37 branches in the Los Angeles area for my office, and they wanted to know what branch I would most like to go to because they'd like to try and get me there if they could. And I picked Santa Monica, which is at the beach, and Inglewood, which is right by the airport, which are both about equal distance from where I live. And he said, look, I can't promise you that I can get you either one of those places, but if we can, we're really going to try. And so about a week later, I really wanted to go to Santa Monica. It's prettier and, whatever. And I was very touched that they had taken this time. So about a week later, I found out that I was being sent to Inglewood. And I was very grateful because there's 37 places, and a lot of them are really far, and I was really lucky that I could get to pick it all and get to go to this place. And so I was very grateful until I found out that another woman was going the same day to Santa Monica. And she knows, she's friends with the number 2 man in my office. And I went through this whole thing where I thought, look, I go to work and I just turn my life and my will over, and I just try and get everything done, and God's going to take care of everything. I don't worry about when I'm going to get a raise and when I'm going to get promoted and where I'm going and how I'm going to get to the top. That's not my business, It doesn't matter because God's taking care of it and we're on His timetable. And then this woman gets this assignment that was supposed to be mine because she knows somebody. And I thought, this is not spiritual. It is not working. And I was very upset. And I thought about this a lot, and it was just churning up and eating up inside of me, and I was very insulted. Here a few weeks ago, I'd been grateful to even been considered. Now I felt slighted by everyone. Nobody even knew I had this conversation with this guy, And I spent a lot of time, and I was going through one of those things, and I finally talked to God, and I said, look, I can either quit, or I can go to Inglewood and be the best lawyer that I can be in Inglewood. And that's what I decided to do, you know, and I had to ask God a lot of those days. I had to help me be good at this, you know, help me get out there and do what needs to be done because I want to, you know, and that's what I worked on. And I ended up really having a pretty good time in Inglewood. I found out a couple months later that this woman who was in Santa Monica had to take stress leave because she was having a nervous breakdown because they were working so hard. And I thought, you see, God, why don't you just tell me these things ahead of time? And a couple of months later, I was promoted and brought downtown to help train the new lawyers in my office while she was still in Santa Monica. And when I walked in there, my boss, I'd been there a couple months, and he called me in and he said, June, I just wanted to let you know, he said that we're delighted to have you back down here training the new lawyers. And he said, we brought you down here because of your attitude, you know, about this job and about where you work. And thought, boy, does anybody who knew me in those early years ever think I'd get any job for my attitude, you know? It's just not possible. I walked into the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was 13 years old. I had no place to go. I had no one to turn to. I didn't have any friends left. I didn't have any family who wanted anything to do with me. And I just didn't give you very much to work with, you know. What I have done in the years that I've been sober is I've tried to do what has been put in front of me. I've gone to lots and lots of meetings. I've tried to never say no to an AA request if it was possible for me to do it. And I've tried to get active in as many facets of Alcoholics Anonymous as I could. And incredible things have happened in my life. Very much like Martha said this morning, you know, the miracle for you may be in the making. So don't give up before it happens. I have absolutely no idea what your miracle is going to be. But I know that in the years that I have been sober, in the early years and in some of the farther ones along, I have been in those dark hallways, and I know how dark it can be. But please don't give up before your miracle happens. Thanks so much for bringing me here.